was mentioned, we will be talking about building an ethical governance framework. So a few years ago, Apple, along with Goldman Sachs, launched a credit card that was deemed sexist. And they ended up getting investigated by a regulator. Essentially, what this credit card was doing was assigning higher lending or higher credit transactions or credit things for men rather than women. A few months after that, BlackRock, one of the leading asset management firms in the world, had to shelve their AI model, which was primarily on liquidity risk. And these are just some of the stories all the way up till today. And it's reached a point where the US Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, recently in her address mentioned the risks that AI, which along with unexplained models, and along with that, how risky they could be for the world if they're not explained properly. Now, in her address, she highlighted two key points. One was the fact that these models are black box, and the fact that these models are unable to be explained by the modelers as well as the people who are working on the models to internal senior management as well as external regulators. But why does this happen? These are some of the biggest brands in the world, biggest organizations. Surely there's something going wrong. So over the next 20 minutes or so, we at MathWorks, we will be talking about why this is occurring, what kind of measures you can take to avoid this, and more importantly, where we are and how we've helped clients over a period of time within this framework. So before that, for the sake of completeness, I'd just like to introduce what responsible AI is for a lot of you who are working or who are new to the organization, to that particular concept. So, responsible AI is this blanket term, but essentially what it's trying to say is it's a way of building models in an ethical manner to maximize the outcome or the business value that you get from artificial intelligence, along with minimizing the risk that you would encounter, particularly with internal and external stakeholders. And the two key terms of responsible AI are explainability and interpretability. Now, essentially, the explainability, the way it works is if you look at the credit rating process, for example, most of the models, primarily probably are logistic regression models, which tell you whether the credit is approved or not, a simple yes or no question. But explainability goes one step further. What explainability tells you is why this particular credit transaction or credit line has not been approved for a specific individual. And essentially, it gives you details all the way up to what particular parameters are responsible for the rejection in that credit line. Now, if I connect this back to what happened with Apple, this is probably what they encountered as well, right? Now, while the models, which the regulators eventually figured out, while the model did not have any specific gender parameter, there were a lot of implicit biases. So, for example, a lot of the income that was part of the data, unfortunately, tended to be higher for men rather than women. So, because of this implicit bias, they ended up getting a higher credit line over the women. And essentially, this would probably have avoided it. And that is the kind of pitfall that you can avoid with explainability. Similarly, in the interpretability case, you can discern the mechanics of the model, but eventually couple it with explainability so that it gives you a wholesome view of the entire model, which eventually would lead you to help to understand how it works and also explain it to external stakeholders. So what we're doing right now essentially is that box on top, right? So a lot of us over the period of time have developed multiple AI algorithms, but it's reached a point where it needs a governance framework. And what we are looking to do is move towards the bottom section where you have an explanation interface and also an explainability parametric model so that you have these metrics explaining the model, answering questions such as what are the limitations of the model, why a certain model fails in certain situations, how do I explain that to regulators, so on and so forth. So, long story short, this is essentially the bucket of responsible AI, right? So, there are 6 primary parameters. We've talked about explainability, interpretability, as well as fairness, where we talked about implicit bias. But those are not the only things, right? You also have something like robustness, where you want these models to be able to consistently produce the same kind of results. Along with that, you also need it to be safe and secure, particularly in an industry like BFSI, which is highly regulated. When you're playing with people's money, and it's very sensitive. So it's very important that all the 6 buckets are met so that it gives you the ability to drive more value out of your AI models. Now, having understood, in theory, the importance of explainability, the why we need to do it, with a lot of other things, it's the same thing here as well. Right? There's a lot of implementation challenges. Why a certain thing, despite having enough understanding and enough awareness, why is it not getting implemented the way we want it to over the last few years? So let's take a look at that along with certain regulations and risk mitigations that you can take care of for your entire AI model journey. So on the modeling side, this is essentially the primary issue, right? So as the models are increasing in predictive power, the ability to explain the model comes down. Or in a sense, it's highly inversely proportional. And this is not just because of the complexity of the model. It's also because there's a lot of skill gap in people trying to understand detailed examples and models like neural networks. And that's the reason essentially why, if I take a random show of hands of how many of you are working in this space, which I like to call the explainability sweet spot, most of you would probably say you're working with decision trees and logistic regression. And the reason for that is because it's the best way to get maximum value as well as the ability to explain it. And that is, again, one of the reasons why this concept of having this governance frameworks becomes very important. Now, apart from the modeling itself, right, there's also a lot of organizational challenges. Now, over the last few years, there's been a lot of development of AI algorithms to this day in terms of generative AI, in terms of agent-based AI. But unfortunately, responsible AI came in a little later. So a lot of the organizations, unfortunately, had this challenge of trying to retrofit governance frameworks to existing AI models. And particularly in large organizations, which tend to be a little bit more siloed, working with and interacting with stakeholders, particularly with the second line of defense, so the risk management validation framework and validation teams, is also a very big challenge. So this is another reason why some of these models, while being important, are harder to implement over a period of time. So essentially, your validation team needs to be a part of the entire process to get towards the external and internal stakeholders and get what you want from your AI models. Now that we've understood the challenges as well as what responsible AI is, let's take a look at the data and also talk about what kind of regulations and risk mitigations are there in terms of what you can do. So for that, I'd like to invite our Director for Application Engineering to the stage, Mr. Prashanth.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thanks a lot, Rahul, for taking us through the heavy lift first thing in the morning, for us at least. And it's wonderful to be here, wonderful to see such a full audience, full room, and thanks, Cypher, for this opportunity. So yeah, we got through some of the challenges that organizations are facing when trying to implement AI, especially when thinking about the ethical considerations and, of course, ensuring that models are explainable and that you have a responsible framework for making AI decisions. This is, of course, what we are saying, but what are customers saying? So for us, of course, the next thing what we need to do is take a look at what does Gartner say. Like everybody else, we base a lot of our decision-making also on what Gartner is surveying. And in one survey, they find that the challenges that that customers or that organizations are facing when trying to implement AI in any kind of system. And in this case, it was actually a survey that was done end of last year, end of 2023, focused on generative AI. But when you look at it, the first point is, of course, estimating and demonstrating the value of AI. The second, with 42%, is lack of talent and skills. But then it comes down to what we're talking about is lack of confidence in the AI algorithms itself, in the technology. Lack of data, lack of business alignment, lack of trust in AI. Right? So that is basically what we would like to address is essentially how can organizations get more comfortable and more or have more trust in the technology itself. Moving on, when you have AI algorithms, then what happens is that they're difficult to get implemented in an actual system. So difficulty in deploying these in an actual business process or an application is another consideration that we would like to address as well. And the last one is here where we see, there's a lot of effort going into developing the AI algorithms, but when it gets down to actual production, they never make it there. So it's a double-edged sword, right? It cuts you on the one side that you spend a lot of effort in making this, but then you're not actually getting any benefit out of that effort because it's not getting deployed. So what can we do about that? Of course, you would have heard this in many, many different forms and from many different talks. Model ops goes by many names. You can call it ML ops, model DevOps, DevSecOps, AI DevOps, whatever it is, whichever variant of that you would like to use. But we'd like to just take a simplified version of this and just say, the infinity loop. But let's break that loop. Let's start from the planning process, moving to development, building, testing, releasing, deploying, operating, and then getting that feedback, so monitoring and feedback back to your development process. And this is where a regulatory framework actually makes a big difference because it enables you to, use something that other people have already thought about and implement it for your own sake, in your own environment. Also, it enables you to ensure that you are complying, of course. So, taking a few examples of regulatory frameworks, one is from the government of Singapore, which was, they were probably a forerunner. They released their framework on AI model governance back in 2019 at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And they focus on 4 key areas. And you can see these, the internal governance structures that are important that organizations have, human involvement in AI decision making, so basically enabling the trust mechanism between humans and the technology, operations management, so having a structure to be able to ensure that you can get from modeling down to actual deployment, and the right level of communication with the right stakeholders. 2 years later, Niti Aayog also released a framework or some principles for responsible AI. And when you look at these first 5 considerations, that's the place where we feel we play a role. Whether it's understanding the functioning of the AI algorithm or the AI system, and ensuring that there's safe and reliable deployment, ensuring that there is explainability on decisions being made, consistency, so reduction of bias, ensuring that that when you have incorrect decisions, you can take action on those, and accountability of these AI decisions. These are all things that we, as a technology platform from MathWorks, we can make a difference, we can play a role in that. And there are many such, especially from the BFSI world. So whether it's SR 11.7 from the US on model risk management, from the Bank of England, from Canada, or also FINRA, these are all guidances on model risk management. And they all point to similar points that you need to have a framework, you need to have explainability, you need to be able to explain to regulators what your model is doing and which situations. But it's not that easy, it's complicated. As Rahul just mentioned, the more powerful a model is, the less explainable it becomes. And unfortunately, with the complex world that we're surrounded in, our models are going to be complex. So that explainability is going to be difficult. It's going to be complicated. The processes that we have in place are unfortunately not as cleanly defined. They are coupled. So you need a framework that enables you to actually iterate quickly through these various different phases. Finally, there's also a lot of disruption. We're seeing a lot of new things coming in, ESG, climate change, etc., and compliance towards these, which on the one side is very well regulated in the sense of what you need to actually report on, but on the other side, the format of that reporting, how you write it, what is in there, is not regulated at all. So if you're trying to figure out which companies are complying, let's say, to ESG in what manner, it's very difficult to actually understand that because it's all text, it's all a matter of interpretation. I'll hand it back to Rahul to go through a few examples of how we have solved this for various different organizations and in various different applications.
Thanks so much, Prashanth. Still with us? Everyone high on energy? That's not energy enough. Higher on energy? All right, so as Prashanth said, the key idea here was we took these governance frameworks, we took our understanding of how validation teams need to work, and finally how a governance framework would encompass the entire structure to drive maximum value, as I said. And we created something called Model Ops for Finance. Now, this is essentially where MathWorks Modelscape was born. So using MathWorks Modelscape, what we've managed to do for a lot of our clients is we've helped them structure their entire model governance framework. A lot of it, of course, in artificial intelligence, which goes all the way from development to monitoring. Now, for a lot of you who use MATLAB or who are currently using MATLAB, as well as who've used MATLAB in the past, you probably know us primarily as a development environment, but we're essentially a lot more, right? So we're going all the way from development to monitoring. We have validation frameworks now, as well as independent model review frameworks that can help you. We've got detailed testing environments. We have a deployment environment. For a lot of you who are working on Scala and Spark, and you would need to recode a lot of those models, that particular environment helps you avoid that entire recoding structure. And finally, a model monitoring environment as well, which particularly looks at model performance and drift detection. And this particular topic is also very big right now in the industry. Essentially, what it's trying to say is over a period of time with different regulations, different kinds of data, with updation of data, and also the speed at which technology and AI is growing, it becomes very important to monitor your models over a period of time to give you information of what you need to retire and what kind of models you need to update over a period of time. And all of this can be done in model agnostic manner, which languages, whether it's Python, R, it doesn't matter. We also help you comply with a lot of the regulations that Prashanth mentioned earlier. So let's look at what we've done in the industry and what we've worked with our clients and how we've helped them. So our first story comes from a large regulated bank, particularly at HSBC. So when we started speaking to them, we wanted to bring to fruition their vision of an agile modeling infrastructure. Now, I touched upon this a little earlier, but for the sake of completeness, essentially the difference between an agile workflow and a waterfall model, as some of you might already know, the validation team is always aware continuously throughout your process. So you're constantly in dialogue with a lot of the regulators, all the way from development to production and commercialization. And that essentially not just speeds up your entire product lifecycle, but also ensures that because you're in constant talk or dialogue with these regulators, by the time you get to production, your model is well validated without having any risk of the way we saw with BlackRock, for example, where they spent all that money to develop it, but probably couldn't productionize it because of the lack of regulatory understanding. So what we did with them was using Modelscape, we helped them identify the inconsistencies in a lot of their modeling approaches as well as processes. We did this using the same modelscape framework and also help them speed up their models towards production. And as I mentioned in the previous slide as well, the key was helping them speed up the process to production by avoiding recoding of these models so that they can execute it faster into commercialization. And again, this goes back to the point that I was mentioning earlier. Because it was such a large organization, their governance framework had to be retrofitted. So we helped them doing that to solve a lot of their inconsistencies. A second one from a large regulated bank comes from an unregulated asset management structure. We work with a large sovereign fund in the Middle East. So this was a little bit more complicated, right? Because here what we found out was that they were working with plenty of other tools and plenty of other teams which were over a period of time working on their own processes and their own models. So all the way from data vendors to asset allocation, they were working with multiple third-party tools and multiple processes. So what we worked with them was to avoid or reduce the high interaction time that they eventually had to take between researchers and stakeholders. Again, like the previous case, they had inconsistencies in modeling approaches and processes. And finally, they spent a significant time on onboarding because, like I said, because they were working with multiple essential tools, it took them so long that it affected their validation process because they didn't have effective dialogue with the stakeholders over a period of time. And finally, another one which we worked with an investment bank. So we helped them develop or customize a SaaS model inventory. This is basically a snapshot of how our model governance or model inventory framework looks. This helps you understand all the details of the model, as well as what kind of risk tiering, what kind of models need to be retired, essentially every single detail of the model. So we helped them develop this over a period of time. And once again, the process and the problems were very similar, right? They also said the same thing. Because of the size of their organization, they had inconsistencies in their modeling approaches as well as limited integration time with enterprises. So what tends to happen is because they didn't have enough time to integrate with their enterprise systems, they had issues with information traceability. And we set up this governance structure to speed up that process as well. But we've talked so much about responsible AI, we've talked about use cases, we've talked about some parts of our solution, but we have not really talked about who we are. Why should we be talking to you? Why should you be listening to us? You've been patiently doing that, thanks to all of you. But what's our legacy? Well, to take you through that, as well as wrap up our conversation or the presentation, I'll hand it back to our director, Prashanth.
Thank you, Rahul. So we saw a lot about what we're doing on the modelscape front or on the model MLOps front for BFSI. But I'd like to mention, I'd like to mention that we work across multiple industries. And maybe a quick show of hands in this room, how many of you have worked or have used MATLAB or Simulink, our products in the past? Right? And that's a pretty large number. Right? And probably you have used it during college or in university times, but we are also very represented in automotive, aerospace, industrial automation, multiple industries. One which is key is financial services. And we work with large banks as well as central banks, for example, to help them build their risk management frameworks. We have a portfolio of tools and solutions that cover multiple domains, whether it be coming from asset pricing, over algorithmic trading, down to climate or risk management, regulatory coverage that encompass a wide set of customers across the banking ecosystem. And from a technology perspective, we cover an entire gambit, going from data reporting all the way to scaling up. The advantage of us as a platform, we're a 40-year-old company. Our software is tested, documented, supported, and interoperable across the base. So to wrap up, we talked about a model DevOps framework and how that can be implemented to ensure that you have a scalable as well as responsible AI governance mechanism. And as a key takeaway, I'd say, we have a wide set of tools that cover a multiple sets of applications. Do come and talk to us. We are represented at Cypher with a larger team. We're all here. And of course, if you want more information from us, please do scan this and get in touch with us. Thank you very much.